Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of the Listening Room Sonic Journey. I'm your host, your groove guru, and your guide to the vibes, the cultural DJ. And I have to admit, I am still a little bit afflicted by allergies. It's just that time of year. So I'm going to try to get through this episode without coughing and hacking too much. I'll try to edit out what I can if it's really egregious, but, we'll do our best today. If you're new here, be sure to like and subscribe. New episodes every Thursday. And be sure to check out the socials, the TikTok and Instagram for Cultural DJ. The links for that will be in the description. And also be sure to check out the accompanying playlist of songs for this episode. That will also be linked in the description as well for both the Spotify and the YouTube accounts. So, today's topic for episode 7 is the Paisley Underground. What is Paisley Underground, and where did such a name even come from? Well, putting it simply, Paisley Underground was a scene built from a collective of like-minded musicians in 1980s Los Angeles, California. They were all heavily interested in 60s pop music, particularly psychedelia, but that also included jangle pop, folk pop, garage rock. So they were just a conglomerate of youngsters who were really into music of the 1960s. And they would blend these elements of 60s pop music with their more contemporary aesthetics of indie rock and punk rock of the 1980s. So they were it was kind of a marriage of 60s pop with 80s indie and punk rock. To call it a revival of 60s pop music, I think I'd be a bit remiss to use the term revival, because it wasn't so much a revival of 60s pop music. It was more of just the influence, the proliferation of 60s sonic aesthetics being added to what they were already kind of doing in the 80s. It was just a lot of interest, a lot of intrigue, deep respect for the sounds of the 60s. But it's worth noting that even though they were using elements of like psychedelic music, psychedelic rock and such, the bands that were involved in this scene were not, they weren't hippies. They weren't doing free love. They weren't, it wasn't a flower power thing. And we'll talk more about this as we go on, but I want to get that out of the way, that the lifestyle of the hippies in the 60s, not even just the hippies, but the ones who were making the music that inspired Paisley Underground in the 60s, was not really present at all in the 80s for the actual Paisley Underground scene. So I wouldn't so much call it a movement. I would definitely call it more of a scene than a movement, because movement kind of implies a reaction to something. And of course in the 60s, a lot of hippies and people within that realm were reacting to things like the Vietnam War and just the older generation and their kind of restrictedness. But yeah, to say it's a movement would be a little misleading, so we're going to refer to it as a scene and not a movement, because there really was no pushback on anything, nothing to react to, nothing to really fight against. They weren't fighting the power or anything like that, or fighting the man. This was just a scene of kids who wanted to make music that they were inspired by, that they were influenced by. So some of the core bands that really make up the Paisley Underground include the Dream Syndicate, the Bangles, the Rain Parade, and the 3 O'Clock. These 4 bands were the foundational groups within the scene. And I want to pull from an article from Masterclass from 2021 called Paisley Underground, History and Sound of Paisley Underground, where it kind of delves into the roots of the scene before the scene proper even really began. And it says, the Paisley Underground scene is closely associated with Los Angeles, but its roots trace to the University of California in Davis, California. While in school, UC Davis students Steve Wynn and Kendra Smith began a musical partnership that later became the Dream Syndicate. Local radio stations, including the university's KDVS, employed DJs like Scott Miller, who was the founder of Game Theory, Russ Tolman, a future member of True West, and Guy Kaiser, a member of Thin White Rope. And those three bands are closely associated with the scene as well. So this really shows that even before the scene really even began, a lot of the major players of the scene were already collaborating as far back as university. A lot of them were, DJs on the college radio station, and the college radio would play a major part in the spread of the scene and the popularization of Paisley Underground as far as the bands involved. Because a lot of them were playing music that all of them kind of fancied, and they'd be like, hey, I like that, and, let's form a band, and let's do this, and play this kind of music, and I like these records, and I like these bands from long ago, and whatever. So that's where the roots kind of began, and afterwards, a lot of the members of these bands would move to Los Angeles, which of course at that point in time was a major, it still is, but especially around that time was a major music hub, and that's really where Paisley Underground began. That's where it kind of got its wheels and they started spinning. But you can see that even as far back as when they were all kind of in, not all of them, but many of them were in Davis, California at university and getting to meet each other, that they were already, the collaboration and the community was already starting to build and spread from there. Now, Paisley Underground is kind of a strange name for a scene, but like with anything, there is an origin point to the name of the scene, and it dates back to 1982, where Michael Quercio of the band The 3 O'Clock had an interview with LA Weekly. And as the story goes, Quercio was with a good friend of his, Lena Cedillo, who was the bass player for a punk group called The Peer Group. And they were on the same bill for a show. And one evening, the Peer Group had a rehearsal, which Cedillo taped. And one of the numbers had a spoken word middle section in it. And on this occasion, Cedillo was wearing a red paisley dress that she bought from a thrift store. And this caught the eyes of Quercio, which prompted him to say the immortal words from the Paisley Underground. Now, when Cedillo heard the tape back, she noticed the phrase, the Paisley Underground, and she repeated it to Quercio over the phone the next day. They both ran this 60s music listening group together, right? And they thought the name was really cool, so they started to use it, and then when Quercio had the interview with LA Weekly, right, and he was asked to describe the feeling of the Bangles and the Rain Parade and his band, The 3 O'Clock, sharing the same bill. That's when he dropped the name, the Paisley Underground. And then the interviewer pretty much ran with that, and it's been off to the races from there. So Michael Quercio came up with the name, the Paisley Underground. Of course, he probably didn't think that it would catch on the way that it did, but that's the origin of the name, which I think is really fitting because, if you've seen Paisley textures or designs and patterns, you see that it's pretty psychedelic. I mean, it harkens back to the days of the 60s, of course, when Paisley was a very common design and texture to use for clothes, but Paisley is kind of like a trippy psychedelic design. And at this point in time, of course, a lot of these bands were indeed underground. It was very DIY effort for a lot of these bands. It was very, a very punk ethos at the time. So Paisley Underground, I feel, is a very fitting title for such a scene. And that there is the origin of the name. So we already went down the list of the 4 major bands that made up the Paisley Underground, but I want to delve a bit further into them, but I want to preface it by saying that despite them being all influenced by 60s music, that does not mean that they all sounded the same, right? They all had their own unique sound because they all drew from different aspects and different avenues of 60s music. They weren't all trying to sound like a particular band. They really weren't trying to sound like any band or trying to copy any band. They all had their own unique flavor that they brought to the table. And a good example is our first one, the Dream Syndicate. The Dream Syndicate leaned extremely heavy into the sonic experimentation aspect of 60s music, and they've drawn a lot of comparison to the Velvet Underground, which would tell you a lot about kind of how they went about making their music. They were more noisy and avant-garde. Their sound could be described as, dark, kind of abrasive, moody, versus a band like the 3 O'Clock, who is straight up jangle pop. They had the ringing guitars comparable to like the Byrds. They had really tight harmonies, just really kind of traditional pop structure, like song structure, versus the Dream Syndicate, who had less traditional song structure. And then you have a band like the Rain Parade, who was arguably the most overtly psychedelic, even though many of them kind of had light elements of psychedelia here and there. The Rain Parade definitely they doubled down on it for sure. They had a heavy use of like guitar and instrumental effects, vocal effects. There was like texture and time shifts. They'd go from one time signature to another instantly. A lot of otherworldly lyrics and just really atmospheric sound. I would say that the way they sounded was more akin to like early Pink Floyd, like Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd would probably be the best way to describe them. And then you have a band like the Bangles, who are arguably the most famous group to come out of the Paisley Underground. They had a strong presence of vocal harmonies. They leaned, of course, very heavily into traditional pop song structures. Probably leaned the heaviest into the pop song structures, and they found a great deal of crossover success for the pop charts, especially when you consider singles like Manic Monday, which was penned by Prince of all people, and we will come back to Prince, but the Bangles were the ones who really showed that there was indeed crossover potential or crossover success potential, even though not all of them really grew to be anywhere near as famous as the Bangles on a larger scale. The Bangles showed that, because they, as time went on, they kind of not, I don't want to say like abandoned the kind of Paisley Underground sonic aesthetic, but over time they did kind of lean a bit further towards the contemporary radio pop sound of the time, as opposed to the more disjointed, I get, for lack of a better term, disjointedness that Paisley Underground could bring to the table. So the Bangles ended up becoming perhaps the most famous, most popular, and most commercially successful group out of the bunch. And along with those main four, you also have associated groups like the Long Riders, who were more influenced by country rock compared to their peers. Same with the band Green on Red, who came from Arizona. They were also influenced by a lot of country and Western music. And then you have a band like Game Theory, who, like I said, came from Davis, California. They were more along the jangle pop spectrum. Same with the 3 O'Clock. They're more like jangle pop and baroque pop. And while Game Theory is associated with the scene, they never actually moved to LA. They stayed in the Bay Area. So it kind of goes to show that even though Paisley Underground was, for the most part, centralized in Los Angeles, it kind of had a long arm reach throughout California and a few of the surrounding states. So that just kind of goes to show that there was a bit of a collective mindset of like, we're influenced by music of the 60s, and even though we may not be physically in Los Angeles where all this is happening, there was a sentiment that we're all still a part of the scene. Now, after going through all the bands, where they stood musically and their individual influences, I do feel that is a good segue to talk about who they influenced, both the immediate and the lasting. And one of the immediate influences was absolutely the radio. Of course, they weren't dominating the charts. You weren't seeing them on the top 40 or the Hot 100 or anything like that, but you were definitely seeing them on college radio stations, especially the regional college radio stations. That's kind of how a lot of their musical distribution went about, was through college radio, and also late night music programs. They weren't getting a whole lot of support from the major music companies at large. Like I said, it's a very DIY punk ethos type of dealie. But there was a sizable community effort as far as the fans of these bands and the growth of the scene itself. So a lot of students at these colleges would be playing their music as well as many adjacent bands within that realm of kind of the early alternative rock scene on the college airwaves. Like I said before, the only real commercially successful band out of the group was the Bangles. And hey, speaking of the Bangles, Prince. Prince was notably a huge fan of the movement, believe it or not. Not only did he write the song Manic Monday for the Bangles, it said that he had a crush on the lead singer. Not only did he write the song Manic Monday, but he actually also signed the 3 O'Clock to his Paisley Park label. And that title might stick out to you a little bit, Paisley Park. It is suggested that the Paisley Underground may or may not have directly influenced Prince during that period in time, around the time he put out his album Around the World in a Day, which is notably influenced quite a bit by 60s psychedelia. So there's that for one. And then him not only titling a song Paisley Park, but then also naming his home Paisley Park. We talked about this the last episode, so I'm not going to delve too deep into all of that. But it can't be minor coincidence. Michael Quirso himself said that Prince would often attend their shows and ask to jam with them sometimes after the shows. So Prince did perhaps have a sizable influence on the popularity and the commercial success of the Bangles. And then a few years later, if you head a bit further down southeast to Ruston, Louisiana, you'll find the Elephant Six Recording Company. And if you know anything about the Elephant Six Recording Company, you'll know exactly where I'm going with this. If you haven't, they were a group of like-minded friends who were big into punk rock, but also major fans of 60s pop music. And they started forming bands where the members would be in different bands at the same time. And they had tight harmonies and this DIY ethos of creating music and production. And you see where I'm going with this. Now, I don't want to say that the Elephant Six Recording Company straight up ripped off Paisley Underground, but you can absolutely see that the spirit was there, that the influence was there, as far as how the Elephant Six Recording Company went about making their music. I really think it's just a matter of that being kind of the wave at the time, kind of that 60s revival wave, that psychedelia revival wave happening at that time. So it wasn't even so much that they were copying them or anything, or that they said, oh, hey, they're doing that over there, we should do this over here, because it's just as well that they were all into the same kind of music from the 60s at the same time. I have doubts that it was them seeing what the Paisley Underground folks were doing and trying to bite off of them. I really just feel that at that point in time, indie and alternative rock were kind of just moving in that direction of incorporating elements of 60s pop and psychedelia and jangle pop into their sound. But even then, the Elephant Six Recording Collective went about making their music in a totally different way, and it sounds completely different from anything that the Paisley Underground bands did. But with 60s pop revivalism being kind of the wave of the late 80s and early 90s in the indie rock scene, you definitely see a good amount of it slip into the later 90s and then the 2000s and even onward from there. Because from then on, neo-psychedelia became a major component for rock of the 2000s and even the 2010s and onward. Heck, even to this very day, neo-psychedelia has become quite a hot commodity as far as indie rock is concerned. We won't run down the list, but you see it in bands like Tame Impala or Pond or King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, some of like the top bands of that genre. And a lot of the way in which they incorporate those 60s influenced sounds into their more contemporary foundation can be traced back to the Paisley Underground to some degree. They're not solely responsible, obviously, but even still, we can't pretend like their contributions to the indie and alternative rock scenes were small time. I mean, they directly helped to facilitate that entire scene and that sound that became so popular in the 90s and the early 2000s. Even across the pond in England, they started incorporating elements of psychedelic music in what they were doing when it came to genres like Britpop or Baggy or even Manchester. The Paisley Underground might not have been a big deal commercially, but culturally, I have no doubt. And with all that being said, I will leave you all off with that. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. And if you did enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. Be sure to check out the socials again on TikTok and Instagram. The links will be in the description. Check out the accompanying playlists. That'll also be in the description for those links. I also check out the Substack for any articles or essays that I publish. The link for that will be in the description as well. And yeah, thank you all again so much for listening. I will see you all next time. New episodes every Thursday. This is the Cultural DJ signing off.